and that is the church and state from Constantine. I just want to briefly go through what we covered in the last talk. We've looked at the positive and negative aspects of the church during the reign of the Emperor Constantine, who reigned from 314 to 317 AD. The greatest thing that he provided to the church was the Council of Nicaea in 325. And an important thing, an important effect of the Council of Nicaea was to refute the doctrine of Arianism, that is, a denial of the divine nature of the Lord. It stated clearly, with the agreement of all, the two natures of Christ and the three persons of the Godhead. It summarized the faith in what is called the Nicene Creed, which is accepted continually through the years, first of all in the Roman Empire, and then later through the centuries. But it did have a negative aspect, this particular period, and that is particularly the church and state were closely related. To be a member of the church was to be a member of the state. They were closely intertwined. And this became a problem right, in fact, to the 17th century. And the second negative is the papacy continued. It started reputedly with Rome, acknowledging that Peter was the first pope. The suggestion, the tradition was that Peter made his way to Rome before his death, and he was actually martyred in Rome, and it was acknowledged as the first pope. The second pope was a man called Linus, who was mentioned in 2 Timothy 4 and 21. And the church father Irenaeus confirmed that he was the second pope. Those were negative aspects of the time of Constantine. Also in his time, the city of Constantinople, straddling the Bosphorus, was founded in 330 AD, named after him, of course, and it became an important city and the center of the Roman Empire in the east, and later what was called the Byzantine Empire. And that maintained until conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, when it was renamed Istanbul. So in Sermon 2, I want to consider the subject of the Holy Roman Empire. And I have 4 points here. First of all, the demise of the Roman Empire. Secondly, the development of the Holy Roman Empire. Thirdly, the cult of Mary and its implications, particularly relating to this country. And then briefly, the church in England and Wales. So the demise of the Roman Empire. Well, this is outlined very clearly and in great detail in a huge tome called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a man called Gibbons. And it was due to instability within, conflict within, and also opposition from without, raids from without. And it caused the 5th century demise of the Roman Empire. However, the empire in the West, basically territorial, much of modern France and Germany and Spain and countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, basically became in 476 AD, of the initiative of the papacy, it became the Holy Roman Empire. Holy as the Pope announced, because it was associated with the Church of Rome. And we see the development of the Holy Roman Empire. Its capital was Aachen. And I think, John, you've got a slide here. And the large building in the center, the church building, is the cathedral at Aachen, which has a strong association with the next slide I'm going to show you, basically that of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, in fact, was buried in the cathedral in 814, and basically there's a shrine to him in the cathedral. So what about Charlemagne? Well, Charlemagne was king of the Franks. Now, we don't identify the Franks just with the French nation. It was more than just the French nation. It was part of what we would now call Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and probably other smaller countries like Luxembourg. But Charlemagne was king of the Franks. And basically, Leo, the Pope at this time, Leo III, suggested that basically the king of the Franks became an emperor, basically, of the Holy Roman Empire. And the idea of an emperor, who of course had a commitment to Rome, continued until the time of the Reformation. Emperors arose particularly from the Habsburg dynasty. And the one at the time of the Reformation was Charles V, the Emperor Charles V, the Habsburg emperor. Here he is. And basically, he was the uncle of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. And obviously, he was very displeased when Henry effectively nationalized the Church of Rome in England and basically divorced Catherine. It was not something that pleased him, although it didn't immediately lead to any adverse action. So that's the Church of Rome and its empress. But there were tensions between the emperor and the Pope. They occurred understandably, and right up to the time of the Reformation. When Luther was allowed to go free after the Diet of Worms, basically we attribute that to the kindness and care of Frederick the Wise, so-called, the emperor of the King of Saxony. But at the same time, it didn't displease Charles because he felt that the Pope had too much power, and it was a sort of equalizing factor having this man to be in contest with the Pope of Rome. So though he remained faithful to the Church of Rome, yet nonetheless, he did have a certain sympathy with Luther. Now, a third point here is basically the cult of Mary. Now, this had a historical background. In the Greco-Roman world, as we read in the book of Acts, and in the first 3 centuries of the church, there were female goddesses. They were acknowledged and worshipped by the people. We read of Diana of the Ephesians in Acts 19. We know of Athena in Athens, and there were temples to both of these so-called gods. Now, that developed because there was some desire in the church of the time, particularly after Constantine, late in the 4th century, to have a mother god in the church. And that led to the cult of the Virgin Mary as the mother of God, so called, and a mediator, a co-mediator with Christ, despite the clear teaching of 1 Timothy 2 and 5. In the 5th century, individual churches were named after her, something which continued to the present, to centuries, to the present age. But then, if we concentrate from the 4th century onwards, in the situation in England, the church in England, not the Church of England at that time, because there were 7 kingdoms after the Romans left in the 4th century. And basically, they were connected together through the papacy. So when was the church founded? Now, I don't know whether you learned this at school, but I did, and held on to it for quite a long time, that the church in England was started by Augustine, who became Augustine of Canterbury, basically in the 7th century. Now, in fact, that is absolute nonsense. There were churches in England way before Augustine's time. Now, return to Augustine later. Basically, the Romans came in AD 43 and were in England, or Britain, if you like, for 3 centuries. That was the Roman occupation. What about the religion in England before that, in Britain? Well, it was basically Druidism. Now, what exactly was that? Well, Druidism actually has recurred many times in the history of the world. Basically, it's the oldest religion in the world. It is pantheism. Basically, God is to be found in nature, and worshipping nature is worshipping God. That was the religion of the Druids. But as I say, it's pantheism. It was recalled some years ago in the so-called New Age movement, which seems to have somewhat died out in England and in Western Europe. In other words, these people denied the transcendence of God. The psalmist tells us our God is in heaven. In 1 Kings 8, the dedication of the temple, then Solomon clearly teaches that our God is in heaven. There's no habitation on earth that can confine him. His habitation is in heaven itself. And that is repeated, quoted by Stephen before his martyrdom. So a transcendent God was denied by the religion that was around before Christianity. So my suggestion, and I think there's good evidence for it, is that basically the Roman army of occupation established some churches. They were, after all, included converted men who served in this country. And that was the start of churches in England. Basically, they developed, and they were influenced, first of all, by Celtic traditions. And there's several important figures associated with that. Patrick, despite the claims of the Welsh, was a missionary from Ireland. Columbanus and Columba basically were Celtic missionaries. Columba basically in Iona as a representation of Columba. So The church at that particular time, the early church, was certainly influenced strongly by the Celtic tradition. Now, the Pope was not really very happy with that situation. Basically, and we could also mention Aidan and Cuthbert in Lindisfarne, basically, he was not happy with that situation. So after the Romans left, the churches in England, the seven kingdoms, continued to be influenced by the Celtic dimension. But in 596 and 7 AD, Pope Gregory sent Augustine, as I say, known as Augustine of Canterbury, because he became Archbishop of Canterbury, to evangelize England from his center in the southern region of England. Now, to evangelize, according to the Pope, was to make it clear that what the country needed to do was to conform to the teaching and practices of the Church of Rome. So here was a tension between two things, a tension between Celtic traditions and Roman traditions. So how was this to be resolved? Well, basically, King Oswy of Northumbria, and that with Mercia, was the most powerful of the seven kingdoms in England, called together Christian leaders from all seven kingdoms in the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD. So that's, I didn't think John would get this, but that's King Oswy of Northumbria. So he called the Synod of Whitby. Basically, I presume it was at the Priory in Whitby, a church of very long standing. And it was decided by those who represented their various different churches that they would follow the Roman tradition. Hence, under the name and authority of the Pope, the seven kingdoms in this country continued with a commitment to the Church of Rome, unified by a commitment in every respect as regards religion to Rome itself. In 927 AD, however, the kingdoms were unified under a single king, Athelstan. Athelstan was actually the grandson of Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex, who is well known, of course, basically for his opposition to invading forces, particularly the Vikings. So the Church of England, rather than the Church in England, was established as a Roman church. And after the Roman army withdrawal, there were invasions and settlements of Anglo-Saxons, and basically the Vikings later. And of course, the Norman invasion in 1066 AD. Now, the church in England then continued in commitment to Rome until the Reformation. But we must acknowledge that the light was brought into darkness by John Wycliffe and his simple Lollard preachers. Wycliffe lived between 1330 and 84. John Wycliffe. And basically, obviously, he brought great light into the Roman darkness. He was a Bible translator, he was a preacher, and documented rather, the errors in the Roman Church. His work was mirrored very much by Jan Hus in Bohemia. Hus was martyred in 1415, but both, we are told by historians, had a strong influence on the career of Martin Luther. Wycliffe was not burned at the stake, as sadly Huss was, but his body was abused and desecrated after being removed from the grave, after he was interred. So the Church of England continued to be established. The Constantinian lack of distinction between church and state were maintained, even post-Reformation. So England, like the original Constantinian state, was a sacral state, just as Rome was on the Holy Roman Empire. But the good thing is that eventually, and particularly in the 17th century, there were also earlier in the 16th century, in one instance, the relationship between church and state was challenged. And basically, we started to see the emergence of separatism in the church. And I believe this was very, very important. And basically, we need to understand why separation of church and state is to the benefit of the Church of Christ in any age. Anyway, thanks for listening.